Hey guys, sorry I can't be there tonight. I have parent-teacher conferences tonight, so I couldn't be in two places at once, and it's contractually I need to be with my school. So while you guys get to hear awesome presentations, I get to talk to parents all night. So trust me, I wish I was listening to your guys' speech, but this will have to do for mine. Hopefully I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Look forward to it. I'm sad to miss out on all of your presentations as well, but for my presentation in my paper, I did Walter Hilton. Didn't know anything about him going into it, but he was born about 1340s. Don't know exact dates, and then he died in 1396. We do know that date. So he's been around for about 600 years, and there is no visual representation or even verbal description of him. So you can see my awesome drawing of him as best as I could represent him. Interesting enough, with him, so he was born up there you can see in Yorkshire, England. He's so not too far, about 1340s, don't know exactly when. But what's interesting is he's a contemporary of John Wycliffe, who was born in 1320, and so they were actually together. So Wycliffe was a little bit older than him, but Wycliffe was just down the road at Hipswell, where he was born. So they were in common in terms of not only age, but also in the same era and region with it. Later in life, he would relocate and join an Augustinian, not Wycliffe, pardon me, Hilton would join an Augustinian community at Nottinghamshire. And so it's just a little bit down. He did at some time go into Cambridge, so he would have moved there, but for the most part, he stayed in northern UK at that time. Now, Walter Hilton himself was a layman who ended up converting to Christianity, and when he became a Christian, he ended up becoming a recluse first, and spending time in solitary, and eventually when he came out of that, he became a priest. We know at some point along the line that he became a trained theologian, and it's believed that he actually went to Cambridge and got his education there. And as I had mentioned earlier, he ended up, after he got all of that done, was a priest, he ended up going into an Augustinian community, and that's where he lived out his life. At no point in his life was he actually a priest of a church or a parish, and he never ever held a position of authority. He was just a member of this community the whole time. Now, Hilton was a very interesting character in that he encouraged the scriptures to be read in English. In fact, he was before Wycliffe started encouraging people. He had published documents and written to people, encouraging them to read the scriptures for themselves in English. But what's very interesting is he did not like Wycliffe or the Lollards. In fact, many times during his writings, he just pauses his writing and he goes on these really harsh tangents against these people he considered the heretics of the Catholic Church. And so one of the comments that he makes, you can see on the board, says, "Those poor preachers," meaning the Lollards, "cannot savor truth, since the interior powers of their souls are like rotted teeth." I mean, that's just harsh, and he goes on a number of these tangents in his writings. But what's also interesting in his writings, he does quote a lot of scriptures, especially the Pauline letters, and he always quoted from memory from the Vulgate, the Latin, and then he would translate what he remembered into English for his readers. So all his quotes aren't quite like perfect. They would definitely not be an ESV version, but they are interesting because he quoted them from memory with it. Now, he's most well known because he wrote a lot of works. The Ladder of Perfection is what he's most known for. We'll cover that in just a second. But he was the most widely read and also the most popular English mystic of the medieval period. Not only that, he's considered the first in a historical sense as well as a theological sense. He's considered the first of the English mystics. Not to say all mystics, but those who actually were born and raised in England and spoke English as their primary language. He's considered the first of them. So what about this Ladder of Perfection? It's an interesting read, but the Ladder of Perfection, he proposes 3 degrees of contemplation. I would call them 3 degrees of spiritual formation. And so the first one is the intellect alone, and from there you have the loving God. So after that one, you can move to the next one, which is you love God beyond just your mind. And then the third one is you not only know God personally, or you know God, but you also love him. So it's kind of a combination of the first two. But let's go into this a little bit further. What did he mean by intellectual alone? Well, this is what we would call common grace or common salvation. So he would argue that all people everywhere have the opportunity to know God in a saving manner. So they would know him, and then they would end up being saved by that. So what we call saving faith. However, he would argue, even though that is open to everybody, most people stop right there, where once they are saved, they are satisfied with this state. I would even argue that even that is the case today, where many people know God in our church, they've accepted this gift of salvation, and they've said, that's enough, and they haven't progressed in their spiritual formation. Well, he would say that they would be at this first stage of contemplation or spiritual growth, that baseline of faith. They know God in their intellect, but they don't really have a heart for him. The second one is loving God beyond our mind or our reason. And so in this case, it again is open to every single person who chooses to enter into it. But in order to enter into it, he argued that they actually had to withdraw from the world in order to grow like it. In order to grow here, what we would do is we would contemplate Christ's humanity and his deity as well. And the goal is that we would be transformed into the image of Christ in his humanity. It's actually an interesting thought. I find myself here because he would say that in this stage, we contemplate Christ's humanity, but also his deity, and our mind switches between the two. So it's very much in my own life, like when I read the scriptures, I see Jesus as a human, and I can worship and adore his humanity. But then when I'm in church and I'm singing and I'm praising, I'm worshiping Jesus as God, and I'm worshiping in his deity. And so my mind actually switches between humanity, deity, and that's where he's saying the second stage is, where we're contemplating him in our mind, and we're loving him in that state, but we kind of flip-flop between the two. And then he'll argue that the third level of contemplation of perfection is that we not only know God, but that we love God completely. And in this sense is what we actually contemplate is the hypostatic union, or the fancy word for both Christ's unity and deity, or humanity and deity in one person. So as we're able to essentially hold and look at Jesus and see both the humanity and the deity and the Trinity in the person of Christ, that would be say that we become conformed to the image and the likeness of the Trinity, which was an interesting concept. So we're not only conformed to the image of Christ, but in relationship to God, we're conformed to the image of the Trinity with it. He also would argue, as he notes up here, only people who can get to this level are those who actually become recluses or go out on their own for extended periods of time, so they're solitary individuals and with it. We would probably disagree with that nowadays, but at that time, that's what he said, is the only way you could get that is a full withdrawal by yourself in solitude, that you can attain this level of perfection. Now, the second part of his book actually gets into much more practical. In fact, the second part was really a letter. Both of them were letters, but the first one was, if you will, call it the ivory tower. The second one is a much more man's approach to it. And here's an interesting thing that he presents, and that is the progression of the soul. He would argue that every single person was made in the image of God, but sin has caused us to distort that initial image of God. And what he would call there is that gives us a false image in ourselves. And so therefore it needs reformation. So we have this image of God, sin has distorted it, and we need reformation. And this whole process is done by grace. So once we come to faith, there's the true image of God is what we want to be. Is that's where our levels of perfection. Well, grace comes and it reveals to us false images, what we would call hurts and habits and hang-ups and things that are wrong inside. So grace reveals that to ourselves, and once that's revealed to it, grace imparts the self-knowledge that it's not part of the image of God, and then we work to transform it back into the image of God. So basically, grace reveals the character flaw, and then once it's been revealed, we're able to overcome it or work with it, and that brings a reformation, and we become closer to the image of God. And so we work through these cycles, becoming more and more Christ-like or back into the original design with us. So the question is well, when do you actually receive a level of perfection? I thought his definition of perfection was really helpful here. So his stage and idea was perfection was that a soul which receives grace to resist all sensual temptation and is not even disturbed by them. And I like that because it says not even disturbed by them. It's not that we're not tempted, but it's that when the temptation comes, our soul isn't even like enticed or jumped into it, which I find is very true even in my own life. Things that I wrestled with or struggled with years ago, now when the temptation comes up, you just look at it and you're like, that's not even really a temptation. And so I would agree with him on this, that perfection would be a soul that is never disturbed by sin. Granted, will we ever get there? Probably not, but I could see how if I was living in solitude, maybe it's possible, or at least possible to deceive myself that that's true. But I do like that. That would be a true transformation and true image of God, is to not even be disturbed by sensual temptations. So how does he, not only all that's really good for our modern day, but where's two things that would be modern day relevance? One is I would say that painful self-examination, in the sense that he encourages us to really seek inwardly what is wrong, what is not in alignment with our image of God, and what false selves have we done. And then once we find these, he encourages us to confront those false images and do it with wild abandonment, which kind of leads into the second point, which he says, take extraordinary measures to grow spiritually. I mean, this is one of his quotes, use any spiritual activity that will help you love God. Change devotional methods when necessary and when grace prompts the soul. So he encourages you to do whatever it takes to enter into spiritual formation. And a lot of spiritual formation, as I've been reading, you guys have been reading, has to do with self-evaluation. If we do not evaluate ourselves, then we will not grow, because we so easily deceive ourselves. But once we recognize those false images, then we're able to go to God in grace, surrender ourselves, and let him transform those images into true God's likenesses, or Christ likeness with it. So I think he's still relevant in that idea as well. I want to just leave you with his famous, like, if Hilton was here and he'd say, all my writings go around one idea. And in fact, I found this in about the 3 or 4 different books I was looking at. They all kind of quoted the same idea. Hilton's vision in page after page of his writings is that to know and to love God is to seek him always, and to know that he is there waiting to be wanted. And I like that because it's basically encouraging us that, hey, it's an ever-going activity to keep going and seeking after God, but also that God is in heaven waiting on us to be wanted. And one of my earliest prayers when I got saved was, Lord, help me want to want you, because in my own flesh, I don't want God. But if he gives me the grace to seek him, then I want to want him, and I actually do the spiritual transformation with it. So I just like that God is sitting in heaven waiting to be wanted. So Stephen Hilton, or not Stephen Hilton, that's one of my students, pardon me, Walter Hilton, man of God, been around 600 years, first English mystic, both historically and theologically, and his letter of perfection still impacts us to today. So thanks, guys. I wish I could answer questions. If you do have questions, just shoot me an email. I highly doubt any of you guys will have time to do that, but feel free to. And I will see you in 2 weeks when we're back in class. So thanks for watching. Look forward to hearing how each of your presentations went as well. We'll see you later.